this week, along with the slides and any other notes that we have for you. So thank you very much for joining. Just some standard housekeeping. If you could please keep yourself on mute, that would be great. It's a very interactive session, so do please make sure that you are using the chat function to ask us questions, which is located on this screen with the little chat box. And as we go through today, I will hopefully answer those questions for you. So what are we hoping to cover today? So this morning I'm going to talk to you about a little bit of the background around the new employment legislation, talk about the Employment Rights Bill. So that is the new bill that encompasses the changes. What is it? What's included? And what does this mean for you? What is the impact then on small businesses and how you can mitigate the risks? So I'm really aiming this morning to try and give you as best an overview as I can of the upcoming legislation. It's very informal, it's very participative. So as I said, do please take to the chat function if you have questions or comments or anything that you yourself might want to add to share with the group. And I will leave time at the end of the session to answer any questions that I can. So in that vein, I would be interested to hear what worries you most about the potential new employment law legislation. So what might you have seen that you think, oh goodness, that's a little bit scary, or oh no, I don't know how I'm going to quite manage that, that's come up for you in the last couple of weeks. So if you could take to the chat function, no answer is a wrong answer or a bad answer. I'm just genuinely interested to hear where people are at the moment around these impending changes. So as I say, do click on the chat function and share your thoughts with me on those for a couple of seconds. That would be really helpful. It means I can also tailor hopefully some of the questions and some of the points to those things. So I'll give you a second to do that. Yeah, good shout, John. Day one rights, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Melita. Certainly front of mind for everybody, ourselves included. Okay. Well, as I said, do please use chat. Kirsty and I are going to be looking back at that. So a little bit of background then. Last week at the state opening of Parliament, the government confirmed that it's going to legislate what it's referring to as a new deal for working people. And it positions this in the King's speech to say that it's going to ban exploitative practices and enhance employment rights through a new employment rights bill. The government was quick to say that it's going to do this in partnership with people so that those changes are delivered together with business and commerce. And the speech also, which is the heralding, if you like, of the new legislation, talked about getting people back into employment following the impact of COVID. And interestingly, they are still pointing back to COVID. The notes that we have from the Prime Minister's office that accompanied the speech talks about there being nearly 2.8 million people that are currently economically inactive due to long-term sickness. So there's a real drive here. I guess if you're wondering what sits behind the new legislation, it's really about getting people back into work. Now, I will offer my own disclaimer straight away. The devil is always in the detail with new legislation. As yet, we haven't seen any of the detail that maybe sits around what the legislation is going to be. We've only really had the headlines from the King's speech. And as we get that, I will certainly be sharing that with you. But what it does, I think, what it is fair to summarize on this is that it's going to be the biggest employment law change in a generation, and we are set. And as you said, in terms of, for example, the day one rights, for there to be a lot of change and a lot of work ahead. We also feel that change is necessary. The government itself pointed in the speech to some of the more draconian parts of employment law, and it appears that they are hoping to bring employment law up to date to be more reflective of the societal needs. And if you look across, if you like, the legislative changes that are being offered more broadly, that certainly has been a driving force. So the King's Speech, as I said, talks about the Employment Rights Bill. It is to be brought before Parliament in the first 100 days. That was a manifesto pledge. We haven't had any more update on what that timescale looks like, but it also is going to be tied in with the upcoming first budget, and that's all we watch with interest, because there are also plans to look at things like changing the national living wage, which I'll talk about a little bit further down the presentation. So the Employment Rights Bill, what is it? What is included, and what does it mean? As I just said to you, there is a view that the Employment Right Bill in its current format is slightly draconian. It's had various iterations over the years, but primarily I think was first introduced way back in the 50s and 60s. So immediately there, I'm sure you'll see that there is quite a difference between what was happening then and what's happening now. And it's a piece of legislation that is aiming to outline the government's plan for increasing employment law and primarily for increasing workers' rights. Those rights, as you'll see, as I deep dive a little bit more into those, are, again, as I said, just really set out amongst the new government's view that it wants to update current working practices so that they're more reflective of what's actually happening, in their view, in the real world today. So we do think, based on the pledge, that the bill may be before Parliament as early as October, but it will take some time after that before the law itself is live, if you like, and we're able to interpret it and to basically be bound by it. We are pushing to to get that information as soon as we can. The HR department itself works closely with government. We are often asked for our own views on these things as a SME HR provider, so we are trying to use that channel too, if you like, to get them to get a move on. The government has pledged to make sure they work closely with unions and businesses so that what comes is acceptable for all. So what's likely to be included? So there are various pieces. Some, I think, getting more press than others. Banning 0-hour contracts, additional day one rights, the SSP, strengthening flexible work, establishing an enforcement body, changes to trade union legislation, dismissal protection, and a genuine living wage. And I'm going to touch on the most salient parts of those. Now, as I've said, we aren't in reality clear at the moment around how some of these things will be structured. But as I'll talk about at the end of this presentation, what you do need to start thinking about is being ready to make changes, and also primarily right now, if you do nothing else, making sure that your current contracts and policies are up to date. I'll talk more about that at the end. So probably one of the first pieces that got quite wide public interest was the banning of 0-hour contracts. And it's quite interesting that the government has taken unusually quite an emotive approach to this. So you'll see here they referred, and the King himself referred to, exploitative 0-hour contracts. In the guidance that we've had around this, it says that 0 hours contracts, in the view of the government, offers less secure forms of work and looks to provide more security and more predictability to workers. As you may know from the previous Conservative government, zero-hour contracts themselves weren't particularly in favour, but what this is going to do is potentially, as it suggests, ban them outright. The challenge I think we have here is that it would be unfair to say that the entire use of zero-hour contracts is in fact exploitative, and we are fortunate to work with many companies that use them to good effect. So there's a slightly binary view here around zero-hour contracts bad, and that's, I think, is going to be problematic, practically speaking, for a number of small businesses who need actually the flexibility, which is what the whole thing is based on in the way that they employ and set up their teams. So the view here is ending one-sided flexibility, and it interestingly points to a statistic that over the last decade, there's been an increase in over 1 million zero-hour contracts across the UK. So what does that mean for you then? Well, right now, if you are employing zero-hour contracts, you are going to need to be ready to think about other alternatives to that. And that may be employing people on fixed-term contracts or part-time contracts. There's no doubt, though, that it would on the surface appear that it's going to be slightly more tricky to get to your staffing model if you're using zero-hour contracts, and that becomes a no go. You may also need to think about fluctuating and regulating the work that people do. I guess my view here, as I've said, is that ultimately what we should probably expect is unfortunately, a lot more administration around how we are employing people, because it's really almost pointing into this other change that we're going to be seeing, which is the change to employer status, which is going to be more binary. So some of these things are actually interestingly quite binary. So on the zero-hour contracts, nothing you can do now apart from wait and see what the guidance says. And as I've said, we will certainly be talking to you over the course of the coming months about what you might have to expect. The other piece that has received a wide amount of sort of media interest is the additional day one rights for all workers. Now, this again, when you look at the Prime Minister's covering reports on the King's Speech, they talk about wanting actually, and this is quite interesting, they talk about wanting more workers to switch jobs. And I take that directly from that white paper, which is an interesting reason for applying day one rights for all workers. And they see it as a way to help stimulate the economy by driving more movement and providing higher wages, which again, I can't comment for the government, but that is their primary driving point. It's a Labour government, and we can't come away from the fact that Labour have always wanted to make sure employees have got the best protection that they can, obviously very pro-employee, and that's been their position for some while. So we weren't surprised to hear this was going to be in the manifesto. So what does that mean then in practice? So for example, parental leave at the moment is the allowance to take 18 weeks unpaid leave over the course of 4 years. You're required to have a year's service to take that. So that year's service will be removed, and that will be allowed from day one. Sick pay, the same. And unfair dismissal is a 2-year qualifying requirement. So before you can take an unfair dismissal claim, you have to have been employed for 2 years and can then make that claim to the Employment Tribunal. Don't forget that there are already day one rights for workers. So the rights in terms of the Equality Act, discrimination and the like are all day one rights. Automatically unfair dismissal rights still remain. But this is ultimately going to be an issue. And the reason I say that is that if you look at the tribunal service at the moment, we are seeing about an 18-month wait from when a claim is raised to when it's heard by a tribunal. That can sometimes be sooner, but it would be fair to say that the tribunal system is creaking under the amount of claims that it's trying to deal with. So to provide this as a day one right in the absence of knowing whether that's going to be caveated with any particular thing could really substantially be a problem for the tribunal service. What it will do for you in practice means that you have to continue to make sure that you're following good process. We do think that there will be a caveat that probation periods will be used as a way of, curtailing that day one right, and there being an ability to dismiss during probation. Let's wait and see if that's the case. We may, I guess, as a guesstimate, expect there might be a 6-month grace period for that. But at this point, what you'll need to be thinking about is, are my probation policies, is the probation policy in place? Are my managers using them? Are we dealing with employment issues when they arise? And I would say probably in itself, that's a big thing for us. I think that all of this for me practically means that the phones are actually going to ring more, the emails will light up. And the only way really around avoiding this is to make sure that you continue to follow good employment practice so that you're not in a place where a claim is likely. And that's things like making sure you are properly following the probation periods, that if you are going to dismiss, it's done thoroughly and with the right amount of paperwork and other things to back you up. The employment law, if you like, the way we think about this is that it's the minimum requirement. It's where you should basically be operating from, not where you should be reaching for. So as long as you are, again, on that platform of achieving the minimum requirement, I would hope that these things won't come back to to be a problem for you. But nonetheless, definitely, I think it's going to be burdensome, again, administratively, not to say the least, I think. The other piece that has received quite a lot of coverage is the strengthening of statutory sick pay. So right now, statutory sick pay is £123 a week. It's a 28-week payment made by the government. And if you're paying SSP, you'll know that you don't pay for the first 3 days. The new legislation looks to remove that lower earnings limit so that from day one, the legislation looks to remove the first 3 waiting days and also to remove the lower earnings limit so that from day one, essentially, you may be able to claim SSP. So by quick calculation, I worked out that on the £123 a week, that's about £65.84 extra per worker. Now, obviously, anything that's going to help people in terms of payment in today's sort of tough climate is a good thing. But unfortunately, it can also have an unintended consequence, if you like, that the people that were maybe not taking short bursts of absence off on Mondays and Fridays because they weren't going to be paid may see this as an opportunity to be more freer with not coming to work. So that's, I think, going to be problematic if you are operating at SSP level. That's the downside. The upside, as I said, being that it will mean that people are receiving more for absence, which is always helpful. What you need to be thinking about now is, how are you paying? So if you're paying SSP, being ready to budget for an increase in that potentially. There will need to be a change in the policy wording so that that reflects the new legislation. And unfortunately, we think potentially higher costs in the process. So right now, things to think about here is being on top of your absence, making sure you're managing it in the right way to let people know that those cheeky short-term absences are not going to be tolerated, even if there's an SSP payment for it. So it's going to be more about stricter absence management for short-term absences. Contextually, again, what we understand is at the moment, long-term sickness is on an all-time high. So there are 2.8 million people out at the moment of work on long-term sickness. And we're told currently 1.5 million people below the lower earning limit. So that's the that's some of the thinking again behind why this has been put into place. Do just quick pause there. Do please feel free to drop anything into the chat. I am going to take questions at the end of the session and hopefully try and help you with some of those. So let's move on to flexible working. This, I guess, I see this as an extension of what happened this year, which you'll know was that the right to request flexible working went up from once a year basically to twice a year. This in the guidance that we've been given is centered around wanting to, again, really reflect modern day working. They talk about modern day working practices in the briefing. And it's interesting that what is going to happen basically here is that it will become a right. So whereas at the moment, employees come to us if they want to request flexible working, there's a process that's followed and a decision that's reached. The balance turns, if you like, whereas it's expected that we will offer flexible working. And I guess by association, if we can't, we'll have more to explain to employees. The reality, I think, as I look across our client base, is that our clients are generally quite open to flexible working. And although we've used the flexible working process, the statutory flexible working process a number of times, often with good employee relations, flexible working requests are able to be met locally through agreement. And so much of this, if you like, sits around that whole point that if you've got good relations with your employees and it's a good culture, it's an open culture, then we shouldn't in reality be expecting to have to fall back to the legislative position because, as I keep saying, that is the minimum requirement. Nonetheless, it is going to be a day one right. The practical implication is that we're going to be expected to make more allowance and more adjustment for flexible working. It isn't clear at this stage what the recourse might be if that's not possible, or whether the reasons to deny flexible working will remain unchanged as they are set out at the moment. But we do expect in practical terms that you should still be in a position to refuse it. Just very quickly on that, the current legislation is quite practical in its view that we should absolutely consider the request. We should take people through it. We should give them the chance to share why they need it. But if there's a detrimental impact on the business, for example, so if someone wants every Friday off and actually Friday is your busiest day because it's when you get all of your deliveries out, then that won't be possible. So there are some fairly grounded reasons for refusing it. But even in refusing it, there is risks attached. So talk to me if you are in that space, but be ready for those changes. The other thing to think about, I would be stepping back here and thinking about how is my workforce structured now. If I'm thinking about recruiting people, how am I going to present that? Because we are on the cusp of these changes. We often say to people, can you employ 2 people that are part-time rather than 1 full-time? But I will again just underline that by saying I know many of our clients are already thinking in that space, particularly because the market itself is a difficult one at the moment to find good talent, as I'm sure many of you are experiencing. Unsurprisingly, given the extent of change, part of the announcement was that there will be a new single enforcement body. So at the moment, there are various bodies. ACAS, for example, springs to mind, the leading light for us in terms of employment practice. What Labour plans to do here is to introduce a new body called SEB, called Fair Work Agency, that will be looking to essentially strengthen the enforcement of workplace rights. It's never something that's really been brought into force, as I've said here, but ultimately we should expect that this is going to be happening. We don't know what that's going to look like, but we do know that it's likely there will be powers to carry out inspections, implement fines. Quite what they will look at, again, remains unclear. But it just kind of all falls back to this common denominator, which is that you must make sure that you've got your employment contracts, your right to works, if needs be, your DBS checks, your policies and your processes in place, so that if these people do turn up, that you're ready to demonstrate that. Again, here the devil will be in the detail. Who knows quite how it will work? Who knows quite how the fine system will be calculated? But it's coming, and we need to be ready for that. Again, not unsurprisingly, given the strong link that Labour's always had with the union movement, that it looks now to update the trade union legislation. It once again talks in its background notes about doing this to reflect more the needs of the modern economy, excuse me. And there's quite a quick move to remove things by the that were put in place by the previous government. So some of the things that you might be familiar with here was the legislation that was going to limit the ability to strike to affect the public network, like the rail network and those other things. That is going to be removed, so that's going to be a U-turn. I don't believe that is going any further at this point. They're also looking to make it basically easier for employees to access union support by simplifying the process of statutory recognition, and that process is in place to allow employees to form a collective and join basically a union, albeit again with very particular caveats. But that process is going to be made easier for employees. The Conservatives, it's fair to say, were fairly restrictive with the unions, the relationship often being a little bit rocky. Labour obviously looking to do quite a U-turn on that. So what we will expect, if you have got union presence in the workplace, is that will become more active, and that there will be the ability to organise more action. So if you are working with unions, then it's now a good time maybe to have a coffee and talk about where they are, what they think's coming, and to continue that collaborative approach. There is a place for unions. You know, we work with unions who support vulnerable employees and other things, and they can be good partners. So always try where you can to maintain good relationships with unions, because, as I say, they offer something that sometimes we or employers can't. In terms then turning to what might be changing from a pay perspective, it was announced that the government would deliver a genuine living wage that accounts for the cost of living and remove the discriminatory age bands to ensure every adult worker benefits. So this ultimately means that all adults, we expect, are going to be entitled to have the living wage. So if you do currently pay any of your staff national minimum wage or living wage, this is going to have an impact. So you are invariably going to see an increase. You'll need to review your finances. I'm not really going to labour too much on this, because once again, we don't know in full what this will look like, but the budget is the placeholder that was referred to for this. So as we get more information on that, I will certainly keep you posted. The other interesting point here to call out is that there will be a new piece of legislation introduced, which is called the Equality, Race and Disability Bill. And this will have within it the requirement for equal pay audits for ethnic minorities and disabled people. Now, at the moment, there is the equal pay audit process, which is fairly widely known, not particularly, I think, well covered, if you like, but there's always been talk about extending that out into pay audits for ethnic minorities and those with disabilities, and this will actually bring that into law. So if you're employing more than 250 people, certainly I think you should expect that you've got an additional statutory obligation. But even if you're not, and I'm sorry to keep repeating myself here, but you should be looking across your pay and reward system to make sure anyway that there are no obvious disparities, even if indirectly, that are caused by different things. You know, pay should be broadly, there should be equity in pay and reward. So if nothing else, use this opportunity to go back, look over your workforce, and just pick out basically any of the glaring errors that might unfortunately have creeped in. Finally, then, in terms of the big piece, is interestingly again another extension of the Conservatives' changes in the last year around maternity. So what we're seeing is that there'll be further dismissal protection for mothers returning to work. So it'll become unlawful to dismiss a woman who's had a baby for 6 months after her return to work. This, if you like, is an extension, I think, of this year's changes, which was more around redundancy protection for mothers that have had babies, which will still, as I understand it, remain in place. This won't remove particular circumstances that might be gross misconduct, but beyond that, I think will be fair to say that it's going to become unlawful to dismiss. So even that, if you're thinking about redundancies, is going to be important to be thinking about now. You know, I know people operate unscrupulously. I'm pleased to say that none of my clients, touch wood, have ever been in a place where they've just dismissed somebody for having a baby, and nor certainly do we advocate for that. But what this will mean is that the protection is strengthened. You will want to think about the impact if you are thinking about restructures or changes within your business. If you are in that space, come talk to me. So just before I move on to what's the impact, I thought useful to share some other legislation that might be pertinent to some of you joining us. So there's going to be some amendments to the pension regulations, which ultimately is going to be about preventing people from losing track of their pensions as they work through their life as employees. And many people sometimes have many pots, if I can say that simply. This is going to allow for protection to make sure those pots are not lost, and people can consolidate those into a defined contribution scheme. There is going to be the establishment of a fair pay agreement in the adult social care sector, and that's going to be almost used as a pilot, we're told, to establish what the right market rates will be for that sector, how then that's applied, and from what I'm seeing, the view is that if that works well, that will be a mechanism that will then be used in other sectors, and all of those things really just to drive fairness and competitiveness in salaries, and hopefully try and help the issue we're having in social care, which is stop people from leaving, because that in itself is probably one of our biggest issues. And the other piece is the children wellbeing bill. So there's going to be a lot of work around how children factor in social health and welfare, and also in education and well-being in education. So strengthening those, which I'm sure won't be can't be a bad thing. Okay, so it's fair to say there's a lot there. There's a lot to think about. I guess in summary, I would be at this point just starting to think about these things. So go back now, look at your policies. First and foremost, make sure that you are legally compliant to what's expected of you today. Those changes are not coming in force straight away, so just get yourself in readiness for that. One of the biggest things for us is making sure that managers are trained to make sure they manage properly. So where really this is going to be an issue, I think, is, for example, the right to go to tribunal means that if there's an employee relations issue, managers who will typically deal with these need to be able to deal with them whereas sometimes managers not being able to deal with them actually causes the reasons why people leave and go to tribunal. So you do really want to think now about, how do I make sure that the people that are actually practically managing my people are skilled enough to keep us out of tribunal, essentially. There's going to be much more regulation, and unfortunately with that brings more administration and more cost. So again, I would be thinking about, what does my HR team look like? What does the HR support I have look like? And am I staffed up enough to make sure that I can deal with what's coming? There could well be more trade union activity, and finally, the short service dismissal, which some of you may be using, which is the under 2 years dismissal, is not going to be a way to go. And you'll want to make sure your probation processes and policies are in place so that there are no issues that arise from that. So start thinking ahead. There's really not much we can do apart from that, I think, in honesty. We have to wait and see what all of the new legislation looks like in detail. But you might want to think about staffing, for example. The flexible working piece is definitely coming. So as you're starting to maybe think about recruitment, could you do that differently? If you are just using full-timers, could that be an issue? So something for you to reflect on. I'm happy to talk that through with you if you wish. If you're thinking about any type of reorganization, again, you do really want to be thinking in this transition period about the changes and whether some of those might be would impact the reorganization. And as I've said, finally, I think the other big thing for me is making sure managers are equipped to manage people. And as daft as that might sound, it's not unusual for us to find that's the case. So I guess really getting yourself into a position where you should be down here, compliance should be where you are at, operational should be where you're aiming for, and ultimately strategic HR is really where you want to focus on all of the big and important things like joining up the whole employee experience. We are here to help you with all of that. I appreciate there's a lot to consider. So I'm going to pause there for a moment, and being conscious of time, I'm just going to open the floor now for questions. So please feel free to take to the chat function and ask any questions that you might have. Can't promise I've got the answers, but I will certainly try. And don't be shy. Yeah, great. Thanks, John. So could I elaborate on alternatives to contracts with a fixed number of hours per week? Yeah. It almost, John, I think is a round peg into a square hole, because if what you're doing is using 0-hour people because you need that flexibility, then it might be that on average you use 0-hour employees 2 hours a week or 4 hours a week, and therefore it might be appropriate to employ those people for 2 hours or 4 hours a week. I don't know how they see the transition between that entire flexibility with 0 hours being removed and a much more fixed view being applied, but that would generally be the suggestion. We have a charity we work with who have been employing people on 0-hour contracts, but again, when we've looked back, actually it would be fair to say they're working fairly regular shifts. So we're going through a process of offering those people maybe part-time work, or rolling some of those into one full-timer, or it could be a fixed term if you've got a project. It could be seasonal if, for example, you run summer programs or you have a big rush at Christmas. But it is, I think, going to be a bit of trying to squeeze a round peg in a square hole. I think we've got to wait and see how they see that join before I could really properly give you more comfort than I probably have. But I hope that helps. And feel free, any more questions or comments? Very quiet group. Okay. Well, just while again, do genuinely please feel free to pop anything in that you have. Unsurprisingly, from those of you that know us, we are here to help. So I don't profess to know all the detail, but certainly we'll work hard to make sure that we keep you covered. Our services range from one-off pieces of work to full monthly protection, which is underwritten by a employment tribunal insurance, which, given the conversations we've just had, will be critical, I think, in terms of protection. We do also offer recruitment training. We run our own management training program, absence management, having difficult conversations. And when all else fails, we are here because we love to chat. So if you've got a question or something you're unsure about, then me and the team are here to help you. Please feel free to, please feel free to contact us. And all of our details are on the slides that Kirsty will be sending you. We have set up on the website a new legislation-esque site. You can go on to that now. Excuse me. We'll share the link with you in the notes we send out, but you can do an audit, which is a 5-minute free audit that tells you how ready you may actually be compared to where we would want you to be. So you just click on that, and then there is a white paper on there also around how to what might impact your business. We'll be keeping this hub up, so there's quite a lot of information on my website. Please feel free to use it, and as things change, we will be updating that, and also we'll be updating you via emails, and I'm sure there's going to be more webinars and other things to come. Do please still stay connected with us. We are on all of the social media platforms, my websites, by email, and all of the other things that you'd expect. So do please stay connected. Thanks, Bazren. Kirsty will be sending these slides out in the next couple of days, and the link to this. So please feel free also to share that with your colleagues. So yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Happy to stick around for a bit if anyone's got any other questions apart from that. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, David. Very helpful.
Thanks, Dev.
Bye-bye.
Bye.